making these statements that, oh, we have this justification, and just leaving it forever and saying we have a justification and leave it alone and never look at it again. These things need to be routinely reviewed. I think that's really, really key and really important. So some reasons that these things can be justified would be scientific justification, of course, veterinary concerns for the animal's welfare, and then the thing that comes up most often in rabbits, especially adult male rabbits, is going to be social incompatibility. Another really important thing, especially in terms of rabbits, is that this should not be a blanket statement. Sometimes people will say, rabbits don't get along. That shouldn't be acceptable. That shouldn't be a justification. You can't just make a blanket statement like that and say, oh, rabbits don't get along, so that's my exception to the rule. No, that's not really acceptable. You need to provide a little bit more justification than that. And we're learning so much every day about behavior and different methods of care and different methods of maintenance, and new things are being published and new studies are being done. So it's really, really key that these justifications are being reviewed routinely by your veterinary staff and by your IACUC to make sure that these justifications are still applicable. Okay, and then moving on past the regulations, what do the rabbits actually want? Luckily, there's been some really great studies that have shown us what the rabbits actually want. So there was this one that was really interesting that showed us what female rabbits prefer. And they set up this really interesting cage that allowed the female to go into these different types of cages. And it showed that the female rabbits actually preferred, she worked almost as hard for limited social contact as she did for food. So that shows that she puts a huge value on this limited social contact. As we know, food is a huge source of motivation for animals. And she worked almost as hard to get this very limited social contact as she did for food. So obviously, she really prefers to be near another female rabbit. So this is a really significant study. Some other studies have also been done that shown that females in a laboratory setting spend up to 79% of their time in close proximity. They spent up to 58% of their time in total body contact with another female rabbit, and they prefer to be in the same cage as another female. So these are all really significant ways that the rabbits have shown us what they prefer. And I really think that we should listen as much as we can to what the rabbits are showing us and what they're telling us. So a lot of times people will say, okay, so that's what the females want, but what about males? Because a lot of people think males do not get along. They don't want to be with each other. And in the wild, as we know, males will compete aggressively for territory. However, when you think about males in the wild, they don't live in a system where it's just one male. They live in a system where there's a dominant male, and then there's several subordinate males. So they're used to being multiple males in a system, and they're accustomed to that. So this was a really interesting study done in 2010 where they set up traditional style caging, and then they had these modified cages where the males could be in isolation, or they could have this social access quarter where they had these dividers that were clear, and they had these perforations so that they could have some limited contact with another male. So they could, even though they were still divided, they could touch each other through the panels, they could smell each other, they could kind of touch ears and noses. And they found that males that had these social access panels spent more time in that social access corner. So they chose to spend more time near those other males. They were more active. They had normalized their physiological rhythms. They actually found that they synced their circadian rhythms. And they were less fearful of unfamiliar humans. They found this by doing latency to approach tests. And they think that this was due to social buffering effects of having that conspecific there with them. So this was also really significant, especially in male rabbits. So not only do female rabbits prefer to have another female there, but males have shown us that they even prefer to have another male there. So the next thing we're going to look at is social housing actually good for rabbits? So we're going to look at the benefits of social housing, and then on the flip side of that, some of the detriments of social isolation. So there are so many benefits of social housing. This is just a teeny tiny snapshot of some of what I think are some of the more significant benefits of social housing. If you're interested, though, there's tons and tons of literature. looking at the benefits of social housing, this is a very, very small list. But some of the more significant ones is it can provide a really great social buffering against stress, which, as we know, in our laboratory animals, stress can be a really significant issue. So anything that provides social buffering against that can be really significant. Social housing provides the perfect enrichment because it's dynamic, it's interactive, it's ever-changing. It's something that we can't provide by giving them a toy. This is something that's always changing. By giving them a partner, it's the perfect enrichment. It can reduce anxiety, boredom, and frustration, which we know is important to prevent stereotypies. It can encourage activity, which, as we know in our rabbits, is really particularly important as they can develop things like gastric stasis and osteoporosis when they're in a cage setting. And it can normalize physiologic values. Like we had talked about in the males, they had sync their circadian rhythms. And when you think about things from a researcher's perspective, think about how significant that can be if all your animals on study have normalized their physiologic values. That can be really beneficial to your research outcomes. And then on the flip side of that, this is once again just a tiny snapshot of all of the very significant detriments of social isolation in a social species. Thinking about this not only from the cost to the welfare of the animals, which is extremely significant, but think about it again from the welfare, or not the welfare, but from the perspective of the researcher. These things can all have really, really significant effects on their research outcomes, which can lead to them perhaps having not as good a research outcomes as they expected, and maybe they need to repeat some experiments, which maybe they're going to need to order more animals, and more animals are going to need to be bred, and so it's just going to be kind of a vicious cycle. So you can see how social isolation can really lead to more problems than we even are anticipating. So it can interfere with brain and behavioral development. It can increase oxidative stress. It can increase heart rate, higher white blood cell counts, higher chances of disease progression, increased time spent in abnormal behaviors or time inactive, and they can lead to signs of chronic stress, which, as we know, are signs of poor welfare. So these are all really, really significant things that we do not ever want to see in any of our animal species. Some signs of chronic stress that we particularly tend to see in our rabbits that are socially isolated are improper grooming. So this can be no grooming or excessive grooming, like over-barbering or fur plucking. A lot of times in our older singly housed males, we'll see inappropriate urine spraying, where they'll just kind of cover themselves with the urine and they won't clean it off and they get really gross. We'll see pacing and circling, metal chewing, scratching or digging. Sometimes they'll scratch so much they'll rip their nails off. It's terrible. We'll see aggressive interactions with their caretakers. As you know, rabbits are not a naturally aggressive species. So if you see them interacting aggressively with the caretaker, obviously something's very wrong. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at, that kind of gave us a background of why we're doing this. So how do we actually create these new pairs? We know now that we want these guys to be socially housed. This is the best situation for them. How do we do this? At U of M, we have the luxury of having a breeding colony that creates a lot of our new pairs for us. We do, however, order in a lot of new arrivals. Excuse me. So how do we create new pairs from those? And then we also do have a lot of attrition females that we need to pair as well. So we had to come up with methods for pair creation. Like I said, we do pair attrition females, and we do pair new arrivals from the vendor. I'll go over some methods for pair creation. I will say it is much, much, much easier to pair directly from the vendor. So I greatly recommend if you receive rabbits from the vendor, pair them immediately from the vendor. Capitalizing on that stress bonding from the vendor makes it 1,000,000 times easier. I don't have the exact number, but our success rate from doing that is in the high 90s. It's going to make it so much easier for you if you pair them directly from the vendor. The stress bonding just really puts it over the top. Just a couple disclaimers before we get started. We don't pair any unrelated males at this time. We do pair males, but they are all related. There are some ways to deal with that, which I'll talk about later. And any of our maintenance behaviors that we'll talk about later relate to males as well. But when we talk about pairing like attritions, we only pair related males.